Welcome back to the podcast. I am so happy to have you joining me and Lindsey Wright and Kim Miner as we talk about The Truth and the Beauty by Andrew Klavan. As always, if this podcast is helpful, please share it out and give a review and like and subscribe and all the good stuff. We are really excited. This is a book actually we read months ago, and then we returned to it, and we didn't know if we were going to do a discussion on it, and then we finally decided let's just do it. And it's a book that is very artistic in nature. Andrew Klavan is, at his core, an artist and loves art, and it's a very artistic frame of reference for looking at God and belief and Christianity. So I'm going to give you a quick little overview of what this book is about and why Andrew Klavan wrote it. He gives us all this information in the introduction, and then we'll head into the meat of it. And I think that all of us would agree that there have definitely been major epiphanies that each of us have had at some point in this book. Really key things that we learned from him. So this is kind of how he starts it out. He says, okay, I had pretty much read everything, read all the great, most important books, and was dissatisfied. And as he grew older, one thing that you should know about him is that I think in his 20s, he was debilitatingly depressed and suicidal, and actually went to therapy for a few years. And I remember hearing him once say that he made a decision at that period in his life that he was not going to tackle the God question until he felt mentally well. That he didn't want to, that was just, he felt like he didn't want to lean on that or have any kind of mental confusion about it. And so he waited until later in life to address it. So time went on. Finally, I think in his 50s, he said, he was completely converted, went through his own conversion experience, and actually ended up being baptized. And I think as a practicing Catholic, I'm not positive. So he's going through, he's reading the New Testament, he's having a good experience, like he loves Jesus, all that stuff. But he gets to the point where he feels like it's just kind of confusing. He wants to understand it better. He doesn't really understand it in the way he wants to understand it. He feels like there's like it's confusing, or it doesn't make sense somehow, or it just seems ridiculous. Like, who's going to turn the other cheek with their enemy? Who's going to forgive 7 times 70? Like, there's this high level of expectation that just seems absolutely impossible. And Jesus can't possibly mean that. So he's having this conversation with his son, who's also very much a philosopher and a thinker. And he's talking to his son about this kind of conundrum that he's in. And his son says to him, instead of reading scripture for the philosophy and the doctrine, why don't you just read it to get to know the man? And he said that statement was like the most true thing anyone had ever said to him. So he realized that's exactly what he needed to do. He needed to read it to get to know the man. And he says, fiercely, constantly, I want to know how to become the man God made me to be, how to do the works he created me to do. But the trouble is, he's like, if you're anything like me, you love God and you want to please him and you want to draw close to him and you want to fulfill mission or your telos or whatever, however you want to say it. But you're not sure how to do that, especially in this age of disbelief. And so he taught himself Greek. He heads into the New Testament to try to understand it better. And because he's an artist by heart, and because he reads a lot of poetry especially, he started to see a connection between what was happening in the Romantic period, about 1770 to 1850, and what he was trying to do in the New Testament. He says, in a way, the project of the English Romantics resembled my own project in rereading the Gospels. The Romantics set aside all religious precepts and traditions in order to see things anew. He says that they were facing the same kinds of problems that we are facing today. We sometimes find, he says, the religious whispers of the soul drowned out by the devices and desires of the present age. And these romantics were experiencing the same loss of faith and atheism in the culture religion and superstition had become conflated. And so they tried to find a way to work that out. So what he's done in The Truth and the Beauty is to try to give us his insights about the role that Jesus can play in the day and age that we live in, lifting us out of the material world into the supernatural or immaterial world. And hit a huge bridge for him. One of the things that really helped him was the poetry of the Romantics. And so he's going to take us through that. But the first thing he wants to do is present the problems. Then he wants to show, so the book is laid out in 3 parts. He says the first part discusses the Romantics in terms of the problems they were facing, the symptoms of increasing godlessness, moral relativism, disbelief in objective truth, confusion about gender roles, and the delusion that the sinful human world can be perfected by deconstructing its traditions and reforming them through radical politics. And if you've not listened to conflict of visions discussion that we did a few months ago, we would recommend you read selections from that or go listen to that podcast, at least in conjunction with this one, because we'll probably touch on that throughout this discussion and you'll see the similarities as we go on. So part 1 is about these 3 problems: the problem of unbelief, the problem of science, and the problem of radical politics. And we'll deconstruct that for you a little bit. We've all read it or gone through it a couple times at this point, and we're still learning from it, and we're still coming to understand exactly how it's laid out, why it's laid out. And so hopefully we can do a little bit of a learning, cut that learning curve short for you and you have a better experience first time through. Then he says the second part of the book looks at the ways the poets moved beyond these symptoms and began the business of reconstructing and salvaging man's instinctive knowledge of the supernatural, his sense that he has a soul, that there is a life beyond life, that the seemingly indifferent universe is in fact a personal creator's act of love. It is the wisdom of the ancients translated for the modern mind, the timeless truth restated in startling original terms. So he does 2 things in part 2. He talks about this journey towards solutions from the Romantics, and that's the reconstruction of the soul and the reconstruction of eternity. And then he says, the final part is my rereading of the Gospels informed by that reconstructed wisdom. The life and words, miracles and resurrection of Jesus seen as the surest guide to the deepest knowledge of reality. There's a quote by C.S. Lewis. He quotes it a couple times in the book. And it's a big reason why he feels like that these Romantic poets are going to be so helpful. In short, the Romantics looked at godless nature and Christian truth looked back. This, I think, is why C.S. Lewis, like so many others, found the poetry of Wordsworth, for instance, a stepping stone to faith. So this is super duper important. And it's one of the reasons why the book is laid out the way it's laid out, because first in part 1, he gives us the problems. Then he talks to us predominantly about Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Keats and how they reconstructed the natural world to elevate us to the supernatural world. This is what C.S. Lewis said. For some souls, I believe, for my own, I remember, Wordsworthian contemplation can be the first and lowest form of recognition that there is something outside ourselves which demands reverence. For the man coming up from below, the Wordsworthian experience is an advance. Even if he goes no further, he has escaped the worst arrogance of materialism. If he goes on, he will be converted. And that's, I think, why he's included. So he spent so much energy trying to walk us through this poetry and this Romantic period. And then he ends it with Jesus. When you get to that conversion, how does Jesus finally and ultimately make sense and be that binding link between the physical world and the spiritual world? So with all of that as a backdrop, let's head into problem number 1. So problem number 1 is the problem of unbelief.
Yeah, well, he uses Hamlet as kind of a background to talk about a lot of this. but he claims some of the origin is from Luther's 95 Theses.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is really fascinating because I think generally we hail Martin Luther as like this great, that he did this good thing that caused some changes that brought about some actually really great things within the Christian belief system, right? And
Uh-huh.
different religions and the
Uh-huh.
Bible and
Uh-huh.
things like that. But he's saying that as he put up these questions, that people began to, he uses the idea of purgatory, right? So what that was one of his theses, that purgatory doesn't exist. So what else is the church saying that's not true? And that just leads you down this rabbit hole of questioning everything. Even is God real, right? It just can,
Yeah.
if you go down it long enough, it really can, you know, make you question basically everything, because
Yeah.
before they hadn't. So
Yeah.
He says it released the monopoly that the Roman Church had, the Roman Catholic Church had
Mm-hmm.
on truth, right? And so then and we start to question. So the major question of this chapter, what is truth? Who's
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
Which is the what Hamlet asks,
Yeah.
who is it that is there? Is it just, am I just making things up in my mind? How do I know? So that's kind of
Yeah. And that famous Hamlet quote of nothing is true or false, but thinking makes it so.
exact.
And one of the reasons he explains this is the case is because until this point, the history of Western, I mean, even if you go back to the Greeks and Romans who weren't Christian, there was still this underlying natural law concept being developed and the characteristics of God, in play, and then those being reasoned out. And we talk about that on other podcasts and things. But in terms of where Western culture was at in this moment, the simple equation was Pilate said, "What is truth?" And Christ said, "I'm the truth." And then that became infused into the church. So the church encapsulates the truth and it is the mouthpiece for Jesus. And so it's infallible. And as soon as it caught on that maybe it's not infallible, then it was like a house of cards to a large degree. And unbelief, grew and grew and grew from that point on. He says, I really like this example. He says,
Do
it's
you have a
like
page number?
finding out you had to cancel your big trip to Europe because Europe doesn't exist. It was just a fantasy your daddy had, a lie your daddy told you, a joke he had played on you.
mm-hmm.
And if you thought about that long enough, deeply enough, it raised the possibility that everything your daddy told you was a lie.
Mm-hmm.
You have to completely reconstruct who your father is. Is he a liar or not? Has he always told you the truth? How could we get down this road this far? And everyone's paying indulgences, and they're on the backs of the poor. This corruption is happening, and then all of a sudden the church says, but it's not real.
And what Andrew Klavan gets spot on is that that's happening to the Romantics.
Yeah.
It happened to him personally, and we're seeing it so clearly again today, that we're finding out these things about history and events and people and things that we didn't know, and it's causing a loss of faith.
Yeah.
It's causing disbelief.
Yeah.
Well, and I love what he says here. He says that without some sort of standard of perception, some kind of received gospel truth, there can be no truth at all that goes unquestioned. No truth we hold self-evident, no axioms of morality, no way to determine what's objectively right or wrong. And he says, with unbelief, nothing is certain, nothing is true, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And so it creates this problem, right? Which is what the Romantics were tackling, is that if there's no standard
Yeah.
that generally people are falling, then anything can go. What is there to stop us for thinking I can say this is good or bad just because I say it's good or bad?
Yeah.
Well, and we're in the age, it's the age of reason, right? So that's the tool that we're using to get out of this unbelief, but it has to be combined with faith and reason, right? And so so we have all these, he calls them uncertainty narratives. It's on that same page that you were on, page 57.
Mm-hmm.
Marxism, Nietzscheism, Freudianism, Foucault, right? That they're trying to use their reason, because that's the tool we have now that science, and we'll get to that issue too, but we have this reason, so we're trying to think our way through the doubt. But it's not, it's there has to be more.
Yeah. So the church had said revelation above reason. And as we head into chapter 2 in the problem of science, it's the overturning of that. No, reason over revelation.
Yeah.
We'll reconstruct the world based on man's scientific knowledge of the material world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, can I give you this example? I was recently, a friend was reading me a section of this book about, I mean, generally the idea is simplistic, but the book was about being like finding yourself and being more true to who you are and tapping into the parts of yourself and things like that. And the woman who wrote the book talked about how she had this affair, and she sat there almost like glorifying the fact that she had this affair, because she kept saying it had to happen, that she could tap in to this part so she could find herself, right? And she's like, yeah, I ruined my marriage, and yeah, like there was like damage along the way, but almost like talking about like that it had to be, there was the only way to find this part of herself, this thing, right? And so I think that this really exemplifies that, because when there is no standard, and he talks about this more with some of these poets and authors and free love and stuff, we'll get into that, but I think this is the idea. You can reason yourself into anything. You can find a way to like justify an immoral act if there is no actual standard, right? And so it's fascinating to think, and we do justify those things sometimes because the society we live in now, that there doesn't seem to be this same standard.
Well, when you take God out of the picture, then the only standard is human made, and we're imperfect and fallible. So it's harder to have a standard. That's if you take the perfect standard out, if you take God out, then you're kind of left in the mud a little bit.
Great point. So before we move on to this next problem of science, I have to say that I had already read Hamlet a few times. I think years ago, I did a YouTube video on it. I had just definitely discussed it in classes. I don't know if I had taught it. And, it's one of those classics that just keeps teaching you. But he gave me a whole new perspective that I had never heard anywhere else from anyone else about what the ultimate purpose means. You hear all the time, it's about self-overhearing, it's about individualism, it's about, whatever. And he gives it this whole other meaning of it's Shakespeare's way of demonstrating what he sees as the long-term consequences of the undermining of church authority. And he exemplifies that erosion of the self and erosion of belief in Hamlet through Hamlet's experience.
And Hamlet's from Wittenberg, right? Which is where Martin Luther hung the 95 Theses, right? Like,
which I didn't know. I know.
I think what's brilliant about Andrew Klavan is because he's a writer. I think that if we want to be able to think deeply about things, we not only have to read really great stuff, but to write about them. I think that's what allows him to have these amazing insights, is because he's a writer and he's thinking about these things and writing about these things. And
so did either of you have any thoughts about the Hamlet section, what he says about it? Any I mean, just seeing it through that lens was quite was incredible and eye-opening. And he says, he talks about the transformation of Hamlet. I mean, those of you that get it and read it, it'll be fantastic. Whoever wants to talk about whatever. But he ends this section by saying, and so the play begins with the opening line, who's there? Is there a God? Where, what is truth? Who is man? He didn't say those things. That's just my notes in the book. Like who's there? And it's a ghost. And is the ghost an angel or a devil? Is the ghost real or not? Is the ghost to be believed or not? As a reflection of who's the authority now that these 95 theses have gone up. Any other thoughts about that?
No.
I just like how he connects it to the next chapter that we'll talk about.
Yeah.
So this is page 60. So he says, so the 95 Theses starts this, well, what, how do we know it's true? If this thing that we thought was absolute truth is not what we thought, so how do we know? And then he ties this back into the Romantics, who had seen the fruit of that, the aftermath of that, which was part of it, which was the French Revolution. And he says this, the age of reason had ended with a reign of terror, right? That's the fruit. That's where it ends up.
Mm-hmm.
If you continue to try to keep God out of the equation, if you rely on reason and science and all the things, then you end up with the French Revolution. So then that's transition. We can transition to that, to the problem of science.
Yeah. So what did you think were one, or maybe there's a central message or one of the central messages of this problem of science? What do you feel like he's trying to get across here?
I'll tell you what one of the things that I thought it was fascinating, the way he talked about this generally, some of the examples he used to kind of explain, because he talks about how science takes away our human experience, right? Because we can explain away why the things happen. So he talks about seeing rainbows and the experience that we have. We actually have an emotional sort of experience sometimes from seeing a rainbow, but we can actually just explain that it's light through the moisture in the air and that kind of stuff. And that science wants to make it just about the take away kind of the emotional artistic, because like you said, he's an artist, wants to take away the human experience of those things, right? So he's like, if a scientist could go in your brain and touch the area where in your brain that you could see rain, you're not actually experiencing rain. And they would tell you, no, it's raining, but you're not having an experience of rain, right? So you take away human experience essentially, because we can explain away all this stuff. And so what he says is the success of science in understanding and manipulating nature would ultimately give scientists an aspect of authority, even when they spoke on subjects like religion they knew nothing about. So, because he's saying the soul, science takes away from the soul, right? Takes away from our human experience. And so scientists, because we could explain where, like, oh yeah, that makes sense why we see this rainbow, it inherently denies this soul experience, which is what Christ and things like religion give us, right? Which I thought was an interesting part of this science section.
Yeah. It takes the meaning out. That if you take the human experience out, we're human. And he makes this point too, that because we're human, that's where meaning comes from. That human experience. And so you take that out, and now you're just left. Science can't answer the questions of religion. It can't tell us why. But it can. It does a pretty good job at telling us what, right? But then, like you said, they become these false experts, the scientists that can predict things and tell us things and teach us things, and you become in losing the soul, in losing the human experience. What you're left with is materialism. And so so what I love what he says is because of that materialism, then we start having material solutions to our problems. If you're sad, take a pill. It will make you happy. It will make you have the experience or, the feeling of being happy,
But
even
are
if
you
you're not.
actually happy?
He says this, you see the rain, but the crops die. We can
Mhm.
solve these problems, but we're not actually, because we're removing the humanity from it. And eventually that leads to the removal of women, the removal of the feminine, because that actually is the core of humanity.
Mm.
It's easy to explain if you have something externally that can explain why all the things happen generally, right? Then it becomes easier to say that there's not a capital T truth, right? To deny the soul, because in soul, inherently the soul is what connects us to the supernatural or God. So you can explain away why I behave in a certain way, the way my brain functions, or this or that. Even you can, to some degree, explain away our human experience.
Yeah, we're just a bunch of neurons and chemicals and
Right.
hormones and
That's right. That has nothing to do, these actual experiences I have of the soul don't actually have anything to do with um, anything but my neurons firing, right? And so then,
Causes us to discount it.
right. And so it's easy just to go down that path and say, well, there's nothing bigger than ourselves.
But then we want there to be something richer, something
Yeah.
more. And so we try to infuse it with our own ideas, which is, I think, where we get a lot of the my truth, your truth.
Mhm.
A filthy room is beautiful because it's beautiful to me, and we try to relabel those things because there isn't a standard of truth, there isn't a standard of beauty. And, you know, we'll talk about this in the education series that's coming up, but going back to this ancient idea about education being to help us learn to like what we ought to like. None of that enters the picture because there's not an ought, there's not an objective anything.
yeah,
And
science can't tell us what we ought to do, just
what is?
what is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and you ladies were making me think of something. I'd never thought about it this way before,
I love it when
but
we make you think.
well, so okay, so you go back to the famous Galileo story, right? So you've got the Catholic Church, they're in charge. I mean, they kind of let science do it. I mean, I would say that religion is friendlier to science than science is to religion. But even then, there's contention because one or the other is trying to win the conversation. One or the other is trying to be the ultimate source of truth. One or the other is trying to win the argument and be in control. And so, you have all these stories about how the church was like, no, 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 the earth is at the center of the universe, not the sun, and that's not how things are constructed, and all this kind of stuff. And being antagonistic. And I had never thought about it quite this way, that science is doing the same thing with religion because it wants to stay on top. And it's not one person in charge, but it's like, no, 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 this is the ultimate source of truth. This is the ultimate source of this is the lens through which you see reality. And so that's now science is on top, and the materialistic worldview is starting to trump. And so it's beating down religion because it doesn't want to compete for authority.
Mm.
And it doesn't want to compete to be the source of truth. And so that's why, and he talks about this in the book, how we talk about things in scientific terms. We don't say, I saw a beautiful whatever. We say my neurons were firing or whatever. And instead of talking about what's the human experience that we're having, we talk about it in a scientific term. We reframe our own personal experiences to be scientifically explained. And the other thing I really liked about this rain section, and when he's giving that example, is that I think another thing that he's saying is, it doesn't matter if you see rain because I touched the spot in your brain that made you see rain. There is an objective thing called rain that exists whether or not you saw it. it's that hard, cold reality that you can try to ignore by, medicating yourself or distorting the laws or whatever it is you're trying to do to make it conform to your experience. But ultimately, there is just a thing called rain, and it rains when it feels like it. And it happens objectively, whether you might like it or not, whether you're there or not, whether you believe it or not, whether you experience it or not. It is something outside of just your internal, we touched that part in your brain and you saw rain.
But it's also something that we can experience, right? And that's kind of what the thread he draws through a lot of this book, and what Jesus kind of solves is some of this is these are actually things we can experience with Christ, and because if you just explain it away in all these ways, then you take away the experience. But those truths come with some of those experiences, and that makes them whole.
Well, and it makes them okay. Right? I think one of the reasons science is so alluring is because humanity is messy, and there's suffering, and there's bad things that happen, and it's not clean and tidy,
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to just explain it away. And what the poets help us to see is that it's okay to be human and imperfect.
Mm-hmm.
And suffering.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of that section right at the very end where he defines tragedy.
Mm.
And he talks about, life is a tragedy. And we want there to be a pill for all the suffering that we experience, but we just suffer because we're humans having a human experience. And that tragedy means that you do what you do and you experience the consequences of it. And sometimes you do the right thing and you still have consequences you don't like.
Well, and ultimately it's harder to do the soul work. It's easier just to say, I feel depressed. Like you were saying, Lindsey, he says, take a pill and you feel depressed. But then he had his cousin or someone said, actually, I'm still depressed. I'm just taking a pill to make me not feel.
I just don't feel it anymore.
Right. I just don't feel that way. And so it's, in a way, it's also easier to have science reign because we actually don't have to do the soul work, because that work of the human experience transforms us in a meaningful way rather than just taking a pill to make something go away.
That's a beautiful way of saying that. I love that, Kim. Okay, so let's head into this section that we all talked a lot about back in the day with Frankenstein and the Shelleys and that whole tragedy of the free love movement that was so helpful to everyone around Percy Shelley. And again, this, if the conflict of visions, and Godwin, he represents the unconstrained vision. Godwin is Mary Shelley's father. His wife is Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women. They are this is like our 1960s, right? Like, these are the 6 founders of this same exact movement back in the day. And, she wants to just sleep with whoever, and she just has these husbands from different guys, and Godwin does the same. And then, Mary marries Percy, and he's getting women pregnant, and he leaves his first wife to go with Mary, and then his first wife kills herself because it's just, the destruction is just phenomenally tragic. So Mary writes Frankenstein. Mary says about it, and this will kind of get us into a little bit of this discussion. She says, in the 1831 republication, she wrote, "Supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world." So for Shelley, it's like, oh, this book has been popular partly because people see that Frankenstein is mocking God and just trying to play God and create a human. And then Klavan goes on and says, "To me, the greatness of the story, the horror of the story, and the threat to humanity the story portrays lie in the fact that Frankenstein has usurped the power not of God, but of women. He has made a man without a mother. His science has eliminated the principle of femininity from the creation of human life." The problem of femininity is not, in the table of contents, he brings it up again at the end when he talks about Jesus and femininity. But it was a topic that we were really on fire about at the time when we first got this book and thinking a lot about it. And it's just so fascinating to me that it comes up in this chapter about the problem of science. So why is the problem of science about femininity? And what is it that you felt like Klavan was saying in this chapter about all of that?
I think the problem of science is that it can erase femininity. We can create artificial wombs. We don't need mothers anymore. We can take a pill and either not get pregnant or terminate a pregnancy. So there's that that we were talking about.
Yeah. But isn't science just solving women's problems of the ages? I mean, aren't they rescuing women in a way that God never did?
He says that women are the conduit for the spiritual life of mankind, because he talks about the idea of how a mother's love allows a new soul to become self. So when you have a baby, it only has an identity through its mother, essentially. And so she creates the soul of
the humanity
of the new baby, right? And so of humanity, right? So that she becomes a spiritual life, but then you take science begins to solve a bunch of problems of especially economic things in the home, and it takes her away from the ability to do this because she becomes disconnected from her ability to create in this way, right? So he talks about how the economic usefulness of women began to be stripped away because of the Industrial Revolution, because of science. We had like scientific the technology and everything's being introduced, and so women started leaving the home more. They couldn't contribute in a meaningful way to the home because so much of what women did was actually to bring economic stability to the home as in partnership with her husband, right? So it reminds me of like in Laddie, how the mom makes money of her own through selling different things, and she has certain trees that she grows and she sells the apples, and she makes certain things and she sells them, right? And she's contributing to the economic viability of the home. And so you take that away, so then women leave the home and have to find meaning other places.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and science did solve some problems, right? Our children live longer. We live longer. The maternal death rate is lower, right? But because science is just using reason, okay, here's the problem, here's the solution, and it didn't figure into consequences. The consequences of a woman being able to terminate a pregnancy, for example, are different for a woman than for a man. And so even though there is some liberation, it also had consequences. This is what I was looking for. This is page 83. Under the influence of the doctrine of and belief of free love, so sex without consequences, I saw the two first poets of England become monsters of lying, meanness, cruelty, and treachery. When you take femininity, womanhood, motherhood, and you take the meaning out of it, it not only affects the women, but it affects the men. There's consequences to that. When you take out the meaning and the divine role and purpose of women, it changes things.
And you turn what we could qualify as a supremely spiritual experience of becoming pregnant in the right way, under the right conditions, choosing motherhood, bearing a child. It's, most people that have had children talk about their child's birth as one of the most important moments of their life and a supremely spiritual, soulful one. And you make it a scientific process. You turn it into something that's biological, that's material, and that it's that push and pull between, well, is producing children and offspring a spiritual experience or a material experience, a natural, is it of this world or is it of something higher than this world? And then, there's the practical element in all of this too. Like, we know, I can't remember her name, is it Mary Harrington, who's done a whole bunch of research on the history of womanhood? Because I think one of the things I keep thinking is, I think that a lot of people in the modern day have a paradigm that goes something like this. Wow, I am so grateful for this huge reliance on science that we have and all the advancements that we've made, and the fact that we have therapy, and the fact that we have all these pills, and the fact that we're so aware of all this mental illness, because, everybody up until about 50 years ago, their lives just must have sucked. Like, the paradigm being, everybody was always this depressed. Everybody was always this suicidal. Everybody was always this mentally ill. Like, this is the human condition, but now, thank goodness, we have better solutions than we've ever had before. And to me, that speaks to huge levels of ignorance of real history, but also ignorance of the causes of some of those conditions, and the fact that they are, perpetually on the rise. And all you have to do is go back 100 years to see what people died of and to see what they die of today, to know that we're sicker than ever and we're dying of lifestyle causes rather than disease. And so I think there's a distorted perspective that causes people to lean more heavily into science, because he goes to Proverbs 31, and he's talking about this pre-industrial woman. Because one of the arguments Mary Harrington makes is like, look, men ran the public sector, but women ran the private sector. And they have, and we have this this mission-driven story about Bess Aldrich coming up. And you read about her in the small town that she lived in Nebraska. That woman was busy running the private sector and helping her husband in the public sector, helping run the bank and writing, providing solely for her children, sending them through college with her writing, but also part of this club and that club and the other club, and hosting those things at her house to make society function. And so that's one of the things that Mary Harrington brings to the surface, is that actually we just don't even understand what the situation of womanhood was like. And one of the arguments that it's almost like you were saying, Kim, industrialization happened. In other words, science caused a problem, quote, problem, and then it quote, solved the problem. Because if it stripped women of their autonomy and their ability to run the private sector and to be economically invested in their own homes, then it needed to provide a solution to that. But then all of that gets stripped of the underlying deeply spiritual nature. In fact, I researched this recently because I was really curious, with all of this harping on women, you don't want family, you don't want to be tied down to children, they're expensive, they cry, they spit up, you want to have a career and be important and climb the corporate ladder. Well, it's still the case that 85% of American women will be a mother at some point in their lives. Women still want children. I mean, I was at dinner last night at a gymnastics banquet with a woman sitting next to me whose daughter just graduated, and she's like, well, I had her at 40. Why? Because she followed the dream of career until she was like, hold up, I'm running out of time. I've got to have a child before I lose this beautiful, one of the most important experiences of humanity. So in Proverbs 31, he goes into, who can find a virtuous woman, for her price is far above rubies. And you think of that as, oh, she's moral, oh, she's modest, oh, she doesn't swear. But it goes on to list all these other qualities. It describes such a woman, and it's easy to see what drove her price up so high. She's not only a font of wisdom, goodness, and charity, she's a powerful economic engine as well. She makes clothes and linens for his family. She sells the excess at market for a profit. She barters for property and buys it and uses her earnings to plant a vineyard in it. And all the while she rises, while it is yet night, to make sure everyone in her household is fed. No wonder rubies don't begin to cover her worth. And so I think part of the reason that there's this struggle between, I don't know. I've just thought a lot about why is he bringing up femininity in this chapter about the problem of science? I would have never really dug that deep with it, but he's seeing something super profound about that antagonistic relationship, and what it's doing to, like Kim was saying, to cause people not to do the soul work. I mean, what is getting married? Getting married causes you to face yourself. Having children causes you to face yourself. I was listening to, where did I hear it? I was listening to something the other day, and this guy was or maybe I was reading something. He was talking about how when he had his first son, his grandmother came over, and he told his grandmother, I never thought I could love anyone as much as I love this little boy. And she said, yes, it's like your heart is walking around. And you have enough of those, you give your heart to enough of those little creatures running around, and you suffer with them all your life, right? Like they're suffering because yours becomes your suffering, because your heart to them. And that's the deeper, soulful, really spiritual level of womanhood and femininity and motherhood that I think he's touching on.
And that's what
Well,
science is trying to erase, right? Science is trying to alleviate suffering.
yeah. And I think one of the other reasons that he talks about femininity is because he's using the Shelleys and Godwin and these people, and one of the things he talks about specifically about them is the idea of free love, right? And so we see this in our society today. He says he doesn't really mince words in some of these sections, but he says future generations would solve the material inequalities in the sex lives of men and women by means of birth control and abortion. Through the miracle of science, a woman can now medicate her body so that she can use it for the pleasure without consequence or attachment.
So that men may use it.
Yes, men may use it. I'm sorry. And then she says, it seems possible to me that spiritually whole women might regard this system as an endless nightmare of abuse, a cancellation of her feminine humanity in service to the libertine pleasures of soul-dead men. And then the quote that you read earlier, Lindsey, about that Mary Shelley's sister, who had a baby with Percy, said about how she saw the two poets basically become these horrible people, right?
Yeah.
And I loved how he says soul-dead men. And I think this is part of the problem, is that when you take femininity out, you also lose the soul of men to some degree, right? So these men walking around, if we believe that the women, as he says, are like the spiritual life of humanity, then inherently, if we lose that, then we lose the souls of men too. So they're okay. They're also okay with seeking pleasure wherever they can seek it, and allowing women to medicate themselves to stop pregnancy or to take away a baby after she's already had it. And so all of us are suffering because science has gotten to this point where it is allowing this to continue to happen. And so I think that's another reason that he talks about it in this way, because it's also a huge issue in our day. They weren't having abortions and birth control back then in the same way, but this experience of the free love is the same idea, but now we can use science to change some of those things.
He says in part 3 that femininity is the core to spirituality. So when you lose that, now you're losing the spirituality too. And we've talked about this before. It's women being virtuous and guarding that virtue that is what inspires the men to stand up and protect that virtue. You have to have both. And so you take out just even one half of the equation, and yeah, exactly what you were saying. We lose it all.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of the giver when he finally realizes that he lives in a loveless society, that everyone's real safe and they're kind, I guess. They're decent to each other, but there's no real bond. The feminine has been removed, They are test tube babies, cared for physically by people that are totally disconnected from them, raised by people totally disconnected from them, who are being decent but not loving. And it finally occurs to him that he's with Gabriel, the baby, experiencing for the first time something akin to real love. And when you lost the feminine, you lost the love.
Mm. Yeah.
And there's a lot of loveless relationships that go on, a lot of people who use each other and say it's okay because they both consented, but it does damage. You just can't deny that every choice like that does damage.
Yeah.
So then we've got chapter 4, To Reign in Hell, the problem of radical politics. And in this one, he goes into Paradise Lost. He does some other things early. He does two major things. He talks about the French Revolution and Paradise Lost. Who had some thoughts or insights on either of those that you want to share, or some questions you want to ask? Why is this radical politics a problem of all of this? Why does unbelief lead there? Why is he even bringing it up? Why is there a connection for him?
He talks about the paradox of virtue, and I think this kind of leads to it. A society must be virtuous to be free, but it must be free before it can be virtuous, because virtue is not virtue unless it is freely chosen. But where does virtue come from? So if you live in a godless society, then can you really be free because you don't have virtue? Because if you deny the virtue, the truth of those things, then.
But can't you have virtue without God? Why are those mutually exclusive?
He says this. Because when you take God out, then you take also the kingdom of God out, right? And so then now you have to make your own kingdom. And who's figuring out what this kingdom looks like? It's people. He says this. Now, this is 97, page 97. Now, France was to be fundamentally transformed into a crystal city of immaculate goodness. Justice falling on the thirsty. What?
Conflict of visions.
Yeah.
Justice falling on the thirsty multitudes like rain. Every inequality would vanish. The past would be reviled, and the statues of the old heroes would be torn down. He says later, religion would fall, reason would rule, and here's the key. The only thing standing in the way of human perfection, after all, is humanity.
Our own worst enemies.
In order to make people perfect, you have to get rid of their humanity, because we are not perfect.
And so inherent in that is that we cannot create a perfect society.
Yeah. By ourselves, like on our own.
Well, right. That's the message of Jesus,
so
right?
So why do we need God for values? Well, for the virtues especially. Why is there a connection at all?
He's the standard. How do you know what virtue is without him?
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to figure out virtue without God, then you're using that reason again, and you're trying to figure it out on your own, and what you come up with is not going to be perfect because you're not perfect.
And of course, the idea of virtue is human excellence and a rising above what we see around us right now. And so, like you're saying, Lindsey, I think what you're saying is you have to have something to rise to. You have to have a standard of excellence above yourself. You have to be able to look up at something and say, I'm going to strive for that. Because otherwise, why bother? I mean, he makes this comment at the end. He says,
what page?
This is page 228. If you do not believe that life is more than life, it would be madness to do anything but seize the day and live from pleasure to treasure. And then he goes on to talk more about that. Better to just, if it's all material, if the materialistic worldview is true, if there's no eternal rewards, if there's no afterlife, if it's here and now and this is all we've got, why in the world would we strive for human excellence? Now, some of the ancient Epicureans would probably say something like, well, because we can see that when we temper ourselves, there's more happiness there. But ultimately, most people are too short-sighted to even make that connection, and even then, what's, like you're saying, what's the standard? What are we reaching for? What are we aiming for? What does human excellence even look like? Because Marx thought human excellence looked a certain way, and Freud thought it looked a certain way, and Rousseau thought it looked a certain way, and they were really smart guys. And Rousseau thought we should just go back to the state of nature, and so if it's just a bunch of human beings having an argument about it, then you're stuck.
Well, I also think that I was having this conversation earlier with a friend that I think that often our motivation for doing good, right, like living virtues, is the avoidance of suffering. And so we can see, if we're generally honest and we're generally this and generally that, then we can avoid some suffering in our life. But if we don't believe there's more beyond us and more that we're striving for in this life and beyond, then the suffering is not enough when the lure of pleasure becomes stronger, and we can justify, because there's actually not a virtuous or moral standard to live by, that we can justify pleasure at any cost because it outweighs the suffering that we might.
Yeah, and if my judgment of whatever it is, if my gauge is my pleasure or satisfaction or happiness at any point, then I'm going to be having a constant conversation with myself about, okay, in this particular instance, do I think there's more suffering with the truth, telling the truth, or more suffering with telling the lie? And I'm just going to be constantly navigating whatever situation that I'm in with a gauge to my own gratification, my own satisfaction, my own comfort, my own fulfillment in whatever way. I could be really child-centered. You could go to Covey's centers and talk about all these different ways that you could be centered, and you could gauge your actions based on what's going to be the most comfortable for my child, But again, in the end, those always break down because we're human and we know we're flawed, and we have to suffer the consequences of, or enjoy the blessings of our choices. So this is what I wrote about this chapter. When we abandon God and his value system, we lean into science to give us truth in our materialistic perspective, and then expect government to codify and enforce the truths science uncovers. But really, we are making up our own rules rather than submitting to God's. Government either comes from the rights of the people and their self-governing power, or it comes from intellectuals and scientists who make discoveries that then become law, like Alfred Kinsey going around the world after his supposed sex studies and telling governments everywhere what laws they should have based on the science, because the materialist worldview was winning.
Well, that also feels like the constrained versus unconstrained.
Yeah.
Those two, right? Anyway,
yeah.
sorry.
Oh, just one last sentence. Spirituality breeds a bottom-up governmental structure, but materialism breeds a top-down governmental structure. And we can see from the last few centuries that one nurtures humanity and the other destroys. So what's this whole thing about? Why is this chapter called To Reign in Hell? What's this whole thing about? Why does he bring up Milton and Paradise Lost? Why is that significant to radical politics?
Because he quotes Milton's Satan saying he'd rather reign in hell than, I don't have the quote. What does he say? I'd rather reign in hell than basically like submit to God's. Do you guys remember what I'm talking about? In Paradise Lost, Satan says that, right? And so it's that idea to, I'd rather have my own way and then submit to God's way, even if it means that I'm reigning in hell, because that feels better to me.
Yeah. And even too, it's this reimagining. These radicals are reimagining Satan. In Paradise Lost, according to the radicals, Satan's better than God.
He's the hero.
he's smart and he's charismatic and right? And it's this idea, this unconstrained
Machiavellian.
idea of let's tear everything down. Let's get rid of all the old values and traditions and stuff. Let's make what was bad good and what was good bad, right? And elevate, in that kind of reading, Satan is the oppressed. And so he has a right to get his just rewards. And, it's a different way of looking at religion.
Yeah.
Mm.
This is what Percy Shelley said about it. Nothing can exceed the energy and magnificence of the character of Satan as expressed in Paradise Lost. It is a mistake to suppose that he could ever have been intended for the popular personification of evil. I mean, honestly, does Shelley even know what evil is? Anyway, Milton's devil as a moral being is as far superior to his God as one who perseveres in some purpose which he has conceived to be excellent, in spite of adversity and torture, is to one who in the cold security of undoubted triumph inflicts the most horrible revenge upon his enemy. So Shelley wants this to be true because he doesn't want to be accountable for his life and the poor consequences of his choices. I mean, he is the Satan figure, right? He is the one who made up all the rules for himself, who decided he was going to live out a whole different value system that he was going to make up. He was going to ignore God's rules. And he persevered. He wanted to be a famous poet and he made it happen. And people told him he couldn't do it, whatever. So he's the hero. I think part of it is just personifying that hero in himself. But the idea of radical politics as being the man perfecting man, I guess.
And it's this justification of, so Satan in Paradise Lost is the intellectual. He's smarter than God. So it's this justification of let's let the intellectuals rule. Let's let the experts rule. We've thought about it. We know what's best.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because that's what he says, that he'd rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, right? Because it's better to do what you want and be the master of the things that you want to be the master of than to submit to something outside of yourself, because that's what you're doing when you serve. You're submitting to something outside of yourself. But so I'd rather just, it's all about me. It's all about me, what I want and what I'm going to do.
And power, right? Here we're getting this idea of we're not motivated by love, we're motivated by power. This is page 109. Without submission to the natural order, there is nothing left but to create new orders by Jacobin force. So he's referencing the French Revolution. Rather than the freedom of submission to God's creation, you are left with a world ruled only by power. It is the paradox of virtue knit into the fabric of reality. You will not be free unless you are virtuous. You cannot be virtuous unless you are free.
All right. On that note, let's spend the rest of the time talking about his solution. So he feels like the Romantics did something important. I kind of alluded to it with the C.S. Lewis quote. And then from there, he leads us into what he feels like why Jesus is the ultimate answer to navigating life successfully and seeing things as they really are and all of that kind of stuff. So what did you find in this second half of the book? Let's talk first about the poets. What stood out to you in that section? Why do you think that these poets were so important to him? Why did he spend all this time giving their backstories and then using them to help the reader?
This was a trickier section. Honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. He quotes quite a bit of poetry, which is awesome, and then kind of tries to break it down. And I'm still not great at understanding poetry all the time. So
yeah, I think that's for me was part of the struggle, is seeing what he was seeing within the poetry, right?
Yeah.
But I think the idea, right, is that these 2 or 3 men specifically were using nature to look outside of themselves, to have these experiences, to say there's something bigger than ourselves, right? To see what he calls the supernatural, And even though they don't mention Christ or God specifically, he talks about how in the way that they use language and the descriptions and all those things, that leads us to believe that they believed in something bigger and higher, because they couldn't take those things. I like how he says, I think it's in the introduction, he says something about how they inherently came to some of these Christian values because it is just a part of them. It's just like in the Western world, it's who we are. It says it's the air we breathe.
Yeah.
And so they're taking what they see, they're looking at these kind of values that are so inherent in them and connecting with nature and saying there's something more.
Yeah.
He says on page 17 in the introduction, the Romantics set aside all religious precepts and traditions in order to see things anew. They're struggling with unbelief, so that they're trying to just strip everything to its bare essentials, which for them becomes nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's what C.S. Lewis said with Wordsworth's poetry, right? It's in the nature that we come to first see God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just to be fair, obviously, science is wonderful in so many ways and gives us so many things. And there are many reasons to come to God through scientific discovery, and much artistry in scientific inquiry and discovery, and a lot of things that are really beautiful. But the problem is that there's this really great quote. I'm going to really slaughter it, but it's by Houston Smith, who did all the worldview stuff. And he basically said, science, when you're doing science, you're the superior being studying the inferior. You're studying things that you can control and manipulate, that are tangible and available to you on the planet. That is why it can't tell you about what's above you, because it's your relationship with what's inferior. It's not about your relationship with what's superior.
Mm.
And so when you're in science and you're studying nature, whatever it is, and you're deconstructing it, there's much beauty to be found there. And there's ways, its job is to describe and evaluate. But you can't leave it just there, because that's not all that is. A rabbit isn't just the atoms. It isn't just the hair follicles. It isn't just, its small little brain. It's inferior to us in some way, but it's also superior to us in the sense that we can't make it. We didn't make it. We don't know what makes it. We don't know where it came from. We don't know why it's here. What's its why? What's the meaning that surrounds it as an entity that's outside of humanity? I think this is where he's looking to art, though science does have the capacity. But as soon as science is the ultimate source of truth, then we know our knowledge will never be beyond this world, because science can only tell us about this world. Can't tell us about anything else, and it can't give meaning to anything. It can only say what and not why.
Mm-hmm.
Art tries to tell us why, and I think that's why he leans into art. Art is trying to look at what's above us, what's beyond us, what deserves our reverence when done properly with humility. Modern art, postmodern art, has just become the same kind of mutilating, deconstructing the materialism instead of seeing what's beyond and above us. And so he quotes Barfield as saying, the purpose of poetry is to reunite the language of the physical and the language of the spiritual in our minds, and so recreate the original human experience of the physical and the spiritual as one thing. He says, the poet, simply by describing everyday reality as he sees it, would help us overcome our habit of inattention and lift reality up toward its spiritual meanings. And so the scientist is going to describe a blade of grass a certain way, but the artist is going to describe it another way. And both of them can lead us to new understanding, but the art is more likely to lift us, to elevate us to its meanings and its whys. And I think that's why he leans into the poetry as a segue. But ultimately, I felt like if any of you go out and read this and you struggle with the poetry, just know we're right there with you. We're not great at that either, but I think ultimately the message is, just like C.S. Lewis, it's a bridge, it's a gateway. It, when done, it can tune us into awe and reverence. The feeling of awe is the feeling of inferiority. There's something above us. There's something beyond us. There's something that we need to react to, that's trying to reach us. Okay, last little section, part 3, as we wind up. What are some of your takeaways? What did you love? It's called A Romantic Meditation on the Gospels, and this is where this culmination of everything that he's talked about so far. We live in this age that's like the age of the Romantics. They had these problems, we had these problems. Some certain people tried to solve the problem this way, certain people tried to solve the problem this way. But ultimately it can lead us back to God, and it helped him see Jesus in a new light and strengthen his faith in some specific ways. So how does he feel like Jesus solves these problems of unbelief and science and feminine and politics?
I love where he talks about the woman taken in adultery. This section is really great because he says that this was their law. Their law was to stone people who committed adultery, right? But Christ, instead of criticizing their law or telling them they need to change it or doing anything like that, he says he does not rewrite the law of Moses. He infuses the law with love in which the law was given. By some wonder beyond the power of mere justice, the law erases itself with its own hand. And so he solves this problem by infusing what he says, kind of infusing the law with love. He talks about the law can't cover every moral situation and sometimes have to act in the shadows, prayerfully groping towards the good of an individual case in order to give measure for measure, as Shakespeare says in his play on the subject. The very presence of law, without which we can live as civilized people, is in conflict with the presence of virtue. Virtue, goodness, can only be chosen freely. So Christ, because he embodies virtue and because he embodies love, helps us to create society, if we allow him, right? If we use those things, that is free because we're choosing virtue, because we're choosing him. And inherently helps us navigate some of the tricky moral situations that we come upon through his love, because we can't make a law for every moral situation we potentially might face in a society, right? So I just really like that idea.
So there's this existing law, which he goes into later. I love the whole section on the rich young man, but
Mm-hmm.
there's this law that exists. We feel it in our hearts. There's this Tao and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, every situation is complicated, and we need some other guiding principle.
And so his claim is the radicals would say, what's good for one is good for everybody. Everybody has to do the same things, right? Like, and so, or everybody can choose. And so what's good and what's not good. So either one of those, and neither of them actually equal a good moral society.
Yeah. And I think it's in that same section where he gives the example of the Israelites choosing a king, and how you can either have God as your king or you can have man as your king. And things really started to unravel for Israel when they asked to not have God be their king anymore. And so really what we do when we submit to God and his laws is that we let him be our king, and then we're going to get way better results. We're going to have way more freedom and way more virtue and get our needs met and all that stuff way better.
Well, he talks about the idea of the kingdom of God being within us.
Yeah.
And so if the kingdom of God is within us, then we want to create, every individual who has that within them wants to create that outside with the humanity they interact with, right?
Yeah.
And so it just creates this free, virtuous society because we want to that because it's inside of us.
Yeah, good point. I've still never read it, but Leo Tolstoy has a little book called The Kingdom of God is Within You. I've started a couple times, but I still never read it. One of the things I really loved was just that sentence, even God needs a mother.
Mm.
And this idea that he was fully human. He was born of a woman, and she helped to humanize him. And even he had to grow in capacity and choose his own telos, choose to be perfect by being exactly obedient and by fulfilling what he was asked to come and do, which brings it full circle back to what Klavan says in the introduction about how much he longs to know what God would have him do and be. And that's really the driving force. He says, fiercely, I want to know this. And so that drove him to teach himself Greek and to study the New Testament anew and to put all of this on paper for us. And so
We're trying to understand the man, Jesus Christ. And as we come to know him and his character and what he taught, and recognize both his divinity and his humanity, he was both.
Yeah.
Then we get to, so this is 2:14, and he says, this is the key. Jesus is trying to teach us the trick of it. He wants us to see the world as he sees it, to know it as he knows it, to understand our bodies and ourselves as the language of the Logos, so that his joy may be in us and our joy may be full, so that we may have life in abundance and eternal life in the kingdom of heaven, which is within us. And so as we've gone through this journey of trying to get to know Jesus a little bit better, and to see as he sees and love as he loves and do as he does, that's the trick of it, is that because I have come to know him, I am changed. And because I am changed, I can influence others to also come to know him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, thank you, ladies. That was an incredible discussion. I think I'll end with this little quote on the last page of the book. To choose instead the tragedy of love is to proclaim with your whole life that this kingdom of heaven within you is a kingdom that never ends. And so if we choose into that, we are on his team, and we are seeking virtue, and we are going to be closer to discovering who we really are, losing ourselves to find ourselves in him. So thank you, ladies, for joining me today. That was an incredible discussion. Thanks for your insights. I hope all of you listening will run out, get this book, spend some time in it, send us your thoughts after you've read it. Hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.